since I left Beeson in May of 2006, I have lived in a couple of different places, and I have had many different roles. One of my roles is I've served as a full-time pastor, preaching every Sunday. I have served as a more or less itinerant pastor in times when I was making a life transition. When we moved from Huntsville, Alabama to Kansas City, I made the transition and filled tons of pulpits in small churches, big churches. We recently moved to Columbus, Georgia, that's been 3 years ago, my presbytery, which is my supervising regional group, said, we want to plug you into campus ministry. And for 2.5 years, I worked with college students, and then I did fill pulpits. I'm always filling pulpits, it seems. But anyway, last September, I joined the staff of First Presbyterian Church. And I am an associate. I do not preach every week anymore. So when Dr. Pasquarello called me, I said, I can't do this because I don't preach every week. And he said, well, that's okay. Because what I realized is that as you leave Beeson, if you think you're going to preach every week, you might or might not. If you're in the position of youth work, mission work, an associate of any type, you will not be preaching every week. So, but God is good. And I told him I would preach from Ecclesiastes 3 when he called, or sometime recently. And thinking, well, it's an odd text. It's not one I would typically choose. It's not one my senior pastor is likely to choose either in the foreseeable future. So why not just go out on a limb and do something different? So that's how I got to this text. Little did I know that I was going to have the opportunity to preach this text last Sunday. Now, in my context, I'm Presbyterian. We generally we don't follow the lectionary exactly, but we're very mindful of the church seasons. And one that we do acknowledge and work ourselves through is Lent. And so last Sunday was the last Sunday of ordinary time, also known as the Transfiguration of the Lord. It's always the last Sunday right before Lent begins. Ash Wednesday was last Wednesday. So I had to take a sermon that was moving toward just the arc of Ecclesiastes to Christ and to glory. To take that sermon and make it work for the particular time when I had the opportunity to preach it. So anyway, if you have a Bible and want to follow along at all, the text is from Ecclesiastes 3. And I was curious about this text. I've never really preached wisdom texts. And so, but I'm kind of concerned that people in our world are getting wisdom from all over the place. There are so many places to get wisdom. So I'm like, well, what does a wisdom writer have to say to us? And this text in particular, you know it. There's a time for everything and a purpose for every season under heaven. This particular text, I've had to read so many times and incorporate into funerals and weddings. And every time I read Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, I said, why? Why am I supposed to incorporate that? So this is how I got to this text. Honestly, it was frustration, curiosity, and because I could. I didn't have a date to preach it. I needed something that could fill in. So I preached it on Transfiguration Sunday. So what did I do? Because I hadn't read Ecclesiastes in a while, the whole thing, I sat down and read the whole thing a couple of times. What's the theme? What do you remember about Ecclesiastes? What's the key word? Vanity, meaninglessness, or whatever. I mean, it seems kind of glum, doesn't it? That's what I think of when I think of Ecclesiastes. So I had to read it a few times and look for the key themes and try to understand what the teacher was trying, or the preacher, whatever you want to call him, was trying to get across. And so he's got words like vanity, and he talks about time, he talks about fate, he talks about wisdom, and he talks, and then I just had to, and I was very frustrated. I think that's why I took the text, because it frustrated me, and it is Scripture. So I'm going to love it like every other bit of Scripture. So I gave it the time. So that was my text, Ecclesiastes 3. So after I'd read through the whole book, kind of put my text in its context, I bounded the text. I would not bound this text in verses 1 through 8. There's a time for this and a time for that. You've got to keep going. I could have gone farther. I chose to go to verse 15. If you have your Bibles out, you'll see that this Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8 is a set of antitheses, really. There's a time for 28 things, basically. Okay, so I got to notice what's going on in this text. There's a time for everything. There's a season for everything. There are 28 things for which there's a time. The first set of antitheses are things we don't have any choice in, we human beings. There's a time to be born and a time to die. Well, I didn't have a choice about when I was born, and I don't really have much say in when I die. But the rest of the things, time to plant and pluck up, a time to break down and build up, mourn, dance, laugh, keep, throw away, all those things in the 28 are things that sort of we can make choices about. I noticed that. And I noticed that. I also noticed the way the author bounded all the 28. The first one is there's a time to be born. That's a positive thing, isn't it? It's not killing, it's not war, it's not hate. Those things are all in the list. And then the author ended it with a time for peace. Isn't that interesting that the beginning and the end of the antitheses are birth and peace? Gifts of God, Okay. So then I said, okay. Let's see, where did I go from there? The teacher, then on into the next verses, if you follow along. And I see some of you have your Bibles out. Let me see how I'm doing on time. I'm going to read quickly through this and point some things out. What gain have the workers from their toil? That's a rhetorical question. The answer to the question is nothing, I think. I think it's a little cynical. What gain do the workers have from their toil? He doesn't stay there, but it's pretty grim. And the teacher says, I have seen, and you'll notice in this text, the teacher says that he sees and he knows certain things. He's commenting on life as he sees it. He, sort of no rose-colored glasses. He calls the ball where it lies. I've seen the business God has given to everyone to be busy with. God gives. Not just to some, but to everyone. He, God, has made everything beautiful or suitable for its own time. Now that word, beautiful or suitable, you got to be curious about that word, and it's beautiful in the NIV and other translations. It's suitable in the New Revised Standard Version, which is the version that my congregation uses. So why the difference? It's the Hebrew word olam, and that's not the right word. That's the eternity word. But beautiful or suitable, that particular word can really go either way. I prefer beautiful. And I told my congregation when I preached it, I said, suitable makes sense in the context, but I like beautiful. I think that's what it says most often in the Hebrew. Not being a Hebrew scholar anymore. You know more Hebrew than I do, I assure you. But moreover, God has put eternity is the NIV translation, or in the New Revised Standard, it has put a sense of the past and the future into their minds. And that's the olam word. That's the, it's eternity is a real common translation. Forever and ever, things like that. If you look at other ways the word is used, I think sometimes that word eternity can be misleading because it can lead into thoughts of the immortal souls, or I don't know, timelessness, and in some ways it is, but in this context, I really prefer the New Revised Standard, giving a sense of the past and the future. So I sunk my head into, I made a decision about that. I know there's nothing better for them, that's people, there's nothing better for them to be happy and enjoy themselves while they live. All right? Just be happy. Okay, don't worry. Wait a minute. Oh, wait, I missed the bad news. Back up to verse 11. Put eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. So we got this, eternity in our hearts, this sense of past and future, and everything is beautiful, but we can't figure it out. Oh, please, this is why I don't. Anyway, I know there's nothing better for these people to be happy and enjoy themselves. Moreover, again, it's God's gift. It's God's gift that all, and that is all, everybody, should eat, drink, and take pleasure in their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added, nothing can be taken away. God has done this. God does. God acts in this passage so that all will stand in awe of God. Okay, I'm going to just stop there because I don't even deal with the last verse. That which is already has been, that which is to be already is, and God seeks out what has gone by. What I noticed in here is that God is the actor. God gives, God makes, God places a sense of past and future into people's hearts, and the acts of God, the things God does, endure forever. The people, we got toil, we got busyness to be busy with. We receive the gift of a sense of past and future or eternity in our hearts, but we're pretty much ignorant about a lot. So we might as well just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. That's how this text makes me feel, y'all. So God is the sovereign doer, and we are the temporal, the limited, and the toilers. It made me feel this way. I mean, and how you feel how I feel when I work with a text. I listen to my heart. I listen to the Spirit. I pray. I read that text. I draw diagrams of the text. I outline the text. I question the text. I do everything I can do to help the text get into my skin and into my heart and ask God, what in the world are you doing in this text? God, are you just the sovereign clock maker who winds up the clock and lets it go for us? Do we have any free will? Is it all preordained? Is there nothing we can do to live any better? Has God determined I just had to ask those questions. Did God determine the hate and the war and the bad stuff? Because, we live in a broken world. So, you have to go to the depths, I think, of this text. But then, so I kind of did that with the text. And then I started checking. Well, I probably did a little bit of this before, but I actually read commentaries about the book of Ecclesiastes, read some commentary on the book itself to get it placed in the canon, sort of. But then I really go back to that, and I sort of say, okay, now, this is this text, this is what you got. And you're in a society that is preoccupied with the need to succeed and achieve and to produce and to control. And so I went to one of the things that I got out of my Old Testament textbook is Lesor, is the one I have. Anyway, I graduated a long time ago. It's a great textbook. He writes, teacher warns of the joylessness and futility of such efforts to be, trying to beat the clock and whatever. Joy is not to be found in human achievement, which is chasing after the wind, but in the everyday gifts of God. And so that just, that did my heart a little good. Then other key themes, I just picked up, joy happens when we accept the gift of life and follow God's commands. Within the awful incomprehensibility of the big picture, God has made a gift of the possibility of human happiness. So I have all these, that's what sort of the commentators, were giving me. I needed it because the text still, it took me to kind of a dark place. It left me thirsty, and I don't want to leave my people thirsty. So, that's what I bring, into my study, is I bring not just me and my heart, not just the text and the Hebrew, but I bring a congregation and people who are living and struggling, and they have joys and concerns. And I guess I got a lot of toil out of this text. What I talked to the people about is that this text made me feel like I was on a hamster wheel, like this. Stuff, just doing stuff. It never stops. No control, no direction, no purpose. Okay, so what did this do? It caused me to think about what distracts me from pleasure, Where is my toil? Where am I just toiling where I could be actually joying? You know, what do I need to let go of? How am I living the gospel in my cynical setting? And then my congregation, what's happening to them? We live in a world that's skeptical, divided. There's 24-hour news cycle that will bring us lots of bad news and lots of conflict all the time. We become cynical. We don't really, there's not a hope narrative. We carry the hope narrative, but culture does not, and people are exposed to a lot of that. We had a few deaths while I was working on this text. Babies were born too, but people were dying. People are facing the reality of their mortality. In my congregation, this is always going on. I serve an older congregation, about 400 members, and anyway. And then I thought about time and culture and how we're obsessed with time. I thought about time as a concept of physics and cosmology, and I thought, that was a place I could have gone. I didn't go there. That's too much for me. But what I did think about was music. And so you hear me like listening to, I'm always listening to what's going on around me. But the thing that kept playing through my mind is not a song that y'all know. It's a song that's based on this text written by the Byrds in the 1960s, right? Y'all don't know it, but you do, and you do. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn. And a purpose to every whatever under heaven. A time to war, a time to die. Anyway, it was turn, 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 turn. And there we were. So I got to get off of that. And then Chicago, the band Chicago. Does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody really care? We've all got, let's see, I can do it, but I don't need to. We've all got time enough to die is where it goes. Anyway, then I looked on Twitter, because I know that this is a common narrative in our time, and this is partly what was getting me so depressed. I'd heard that eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die from somebody who was on some award show, and I was trying to Google it and figure out where it was and use it. But instead, I couldn't find it. I ended up on Twitter and found what Vanilla Ice said about time, which is, hold on, I got it. Okay. Let's see. Wait. Where's Vanilla Ice? How about I had it? Oh, life is short. I love this. Life is short. This is a tweet. It's short. Life is short. Live it up. Try to smile as much as possible and help others. When you die, game over. Enjoy. All right, y'all. That's the narrative of our culture. So we got to get past that, and we got to also get to the good news, get to the gospel. And I'm going to go quick. Before I had to preach this last Sunday, I was simply going to go to Galatians. Wait. No, how would you get this text to the gospel? How would you do it? What text come to your mind? Anybody? John 1. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen His glory. Mm-hmm. That's right. Right. If the dead are not raised. Let's do it. That's right. That's a good one. Anybody else? Yes.
Tomorrow has enough trouble as it is. Or today has enough trouble as it is.
Right. Well, there you go. That's a good one. There are a lot of ways to get there. My choice was to go to Galatians 4, thinking about where we were in the church calendar between Christmas and the beginning of Lent. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were born under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you're no longer a slave, but a child. That was my jumping, you got to pick one. So I chose that. And I was ready to move on to actually writing the sermon, which, I spend a lot of time in prep. Writing's a lot easier if you've done that. I promise you, because all those illustrations you think are good while you're studying, I write them all down. I write a tremendous amount. I write with colored markers. I write everywhere. and I don't lose it until I'm done with it, because illustrations kind of come and go like that. So anyway, keep up with them. But one thing I use to help me move from all that kind of study stuff to sermon preparation is something by a Presbyterian preacher named Tom Long, not somebody I met here at Beeson. But he does this thing called focus and function. And the focus is, what does the text say? The function is, what do I want people to do or believe in response? And I have incorporated that into my own pattern of study. So I wrote a focus and a function. I'm going to skip reading them to you because I want to end on time. But that's an important step for me, and it's really hard. I can spend a long time, and then I'll amend it the next day, over and over. But it's really important that as I write, I tether myself to what my purpose is and what my desired outcome is. Because any message can go any number of directions, right? I mean, they really can, still. So let's see. So beginning to write. I call this letting go of the trapeze. When I start to write, it is like when the guy lets go of the trapeze and he's in between and he's got to catch the other one. And there's this moment of terror for me. I am afraid of preaching, y'all. It scares me to death. So I have to let go and let God deal with it and deal with me. And I do a lot of writing, but then I say, okay, God, what's in my notes? What can I pull out? And here's what I found. And this time, I found that I was using the language of storytelling as I was writing how I was responding to this text. And it's something like this. I talked about how God punctuates time. God, let's see how I wrote it here. God's punctuation of time. Well, anyway, that was my device. And somewhere in there I say that God is engaged in the stories of our lives. And in the moments, in the days, in the decades, in the generations. And so I took that idea of storytelling, because I have to get us to Ash Wednesday. I mean, really, this is a jump. And I got to get through the Transfiguration. So I did that. Now, all the while, I'm going to show you what my sermon looked like. But I'm reading. I read all the time. I was reading a book called Remembering Your Story by Richard Morgan. It's a fabulous book on helping people reflect on their lives, generally older adults. And it happened to be on my desk. I'm reading it. I'm reading Why I Left, Why I Stayed by Tony and Bart Campolo. Bart Campolo became a secular humanist. There's a lot of cynicism in there. So I read that. I'm reading The Defining Decade about why your 20s matter. I read Frederick Buechner. He's another Presbyterian. His writing is creative. And when I read him, I'm inspired to think that my words might one day be as beautiful as his. Then, let's see, what else was I doing? I was reading Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. Interesting book. I read what my people read, too. So, that's, okay, let me get a sip of water. So this is the arc the sermon took. You're wondering, what did she do? And this is what it looks like. I have a manuscript up here, but this is what my sermon looks like. There are 6 pieces to this sermon. Here's the first one. It's time. Okay, so we're going directly. The way I did this in church, we have 2 scripture readings. The first one for the day, this was odd, was Matthew 17, the text of the day, the transfiguration of the Lord. The second one, which I read right next to the sermon, was the Ecclesiastes 3. So it gave me a jumping off point. I started with time. Time, we got too much, we run out, whatever. I had this cute little litany of things about time. And the things we say about time, because we're really obsessed with time. And then I found a way to tie in generations to that too, because time is not just our days and our times, but it's generational change. And I had a funny little YouTube illustration of a generational problem. Anyway, but I won't go into that. But I talked about time, and then God is a story writer. So that's my time segment. Then I've just read them Ecclesiastes, but I go to the text, and I kind of sit with that text. I say it's part of wisdom literature. The wisdom writers are wise men trying to help people live their best lives. I got that line from somewhere. and some of that reading, I don't know, but trying to help people make sense of life and do their best. Because there's some God in this, yeah. But anyway, it's not always as God, as you'd like. So, well, it's just it was so fun to do this. I've never done it before. So the Ecclesiastes text, kind of going through it, there's a time for everything. Life is not random. The teacher takes the Google Earth view, is what I talked about. I talked about that song from the Birds, how this made me feel. Turn, turn, churn, churn, hamster wheel. Is there any purpose? Then I said, well, Vanilla Ice says this. Basically there's no purpose. But would the teacher agree with Vanilla Ice? No, the teacher would not agree. Teacher has a context. His context is within the bounds of the Hebrew understanding of the world and of God. So I focused then on verses 11 and 12. God has made everything suitable or beautiful in its own time. So there's both purpose and beauty in life. God has put a sense of past and future in the minds of everybody. That means that we can remember and we can learn, and that we can anticipate, and that we can experience hope. God has, let's see. Anyway, before we know it, we're singing a new song. And so here's where I go to God gives, which is a thing about in that text that God is the giver, right? I had a wonderful illustration that I found in that Why I Left, Why I Stayed book. It's about a character in the Thornton Wilder play Our Town named Emily Webb, who gets to look back on her life, and she realizes that she didn't live her best life. And so I use that as a hinge to go from a little bit of cynicism, but God is there and in it, into the story of God in the Bible and how God has intersected human life and Jesus. And that's where, but wait, there's more. That's my title. The Bible is always saying, but wait, there's more. And I read to them the Galatians 4 text. God says life is good and life is blessed. God gives. But y'all, I got to get, so this is a problem that I had. I had to surprise get to Transfiguration. And this was not what I had planned to do. I would have gone from Galatians to the end, but I had to get in some other stuff. So then I can't remember exactly how I got to it, but I got to the Matthew 17 text and said, why was Jesus, oh, that's right, I was talking about God's story, the arc of God's narrative story here, I think. And then why the Transfiguration? And I talked about my Bible study that I do with ladies on Tuesday night. We had studied the Transfiguration text. Why was he transfigured? And where do we see the glory of God? In the hamster wheel of our own lives, basically. So then I went to your story. There's the glory story, and then there's your story. Because I want people to see God at work in their own stories. If I had read you my purpose, this is what I want. Have another wonderful illustration I got from somewhere in that reading about the storytelling guy, I guess. And about an African village that got a television, and basically the punchline of the story is the television has many stories, but the storyteller, the African storyteller, knows me, so loves me. So it was another hinge. I'm always looking for hinges, y'all, that will take you from one place to the other when I'm preaching, because that's the hardest thing to do. So anyway, I did that, and I challenge people, are you sharing your story? Do you know your story? How is God at work in your life right now? Look backward, look forward, don't blink, it goes quickly. And then, it's almost 1 o'clock, we had to move to Lent. So I just sort of brought it back to the story of, redemptive, what God is doing, and how we in the Presbyterian Church mark time by the church calendar. So I went to Lent. I said, we just celebrated Christmas. This is the Transfiguration of the Lord. Come get some ashes on Wednesday, and just challenge people to engage in a Lenten discipline that would help them better see God at work in their lives. And it's 1 o'clock. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Woo.
Who has a question? Yes, Cole.
Thank you for that. So when you mentioned about the desire in our culture to achieve, what comes to my mind when I read this text often is how does this text sort of look at us when we think of the missionary zeal behind the Great Commission? How would these two texts relate? To go out and make disciples, the sort of evangelistic zeal for a lost and dying world, and then the sort of almost, if not cynical, at least melancholy sort of feel of just live your life because God's given you many gifts.
Right. So how would this relate to the missionary zeal? You know, and I imagine that at the root of missionary zeal is a missionary realism about how life really and understanding the context of whatever your mission field is really essential. And in a way, it's not cynical, it's a really realistic look at life. Sort of helps, it leaves you hungry, like I said, makes you curious, it makes you seek. If you only recognize that where life leaves you is hungry. So I think it translates really well because it is a reflection of the human condition. I don't know.
Thank you again for that. Very helpful and very insightful. I wanted to ask a question. You talked about the focus and the function.
Yes.
And I wanted to just maybe clarify, and if you want to speak a little bit more to how you made that switch and what the function of this text was. Because you talked about, having people analyze their story and think about that, but I didn't know if it was that or if there was more.
Right. I know, it's really hard because I didn't preach the sermon. Yeah, it was helpful that I got to preach the sermon. Okay. Here's what my function statement was. To build a bridge from skepticism about God or fatigue in faith to a hope that encourages hearers to be grateful for God's presence and provision in their lives, in parentheses, stories, and share Christ's goodness and mercy with others, and encourage faithfulness during Lent. So that's did that answer your question? Okay.
You really enjoy reading Frederick Buechner.
Yeah.
Is this influenced by that with his movements? And
No.
but what would you?
No, what I do is I read a lot of things at once. So my reading stack, actually, if I had done a PowerPoint, I had taken all my books that I used for this and piled them up. And I read Buechner just for fun because he has such a way with words and with storytelling. But no, this is in no way influenced by anything he wrote. But I just read his stuff. When I get stuck, but there's nothing of Buechner in this. But he's a storyteller. So it might be, in that way. Yeah.
You mentioned that you are not a senior pastor right now, so you don't preach every week.
Right.
So when you do preach, how far in advance do you begin? And how might the process look different if you were preaching every week?
Yeah. So I've preached every week for a long time. And the process is really similar for me. It's love the text, get deep into the text, whatever that means. Read it, explore the vocabulary, explore the grammar and the form and all the tone, all those kinds of things. And this is my Monday, in a typical week. I don't know, figure out what the context, bound the text. I do all those things on Mondays. And then on Tuesdays, I study and I just keep chewing on the text and I keep writing things down and looking for stories. I mind map. Do y'all know what that is? I do that like in freehand, mind map. It helps me to kind of because I get so many thoughts coming in. And then by Wednesday, I've got to be writing. Or Thursday. Wednesday I have to write. I probably write on Tuesday too. They used to call me the dragon lady at my church because I had this dragon naturally speaking voice to typing program. And I would sit in my office and just dictate sermons. And they're not perfect, but it helped me a lot. So, and then I think I told y'all yesterday that Friday was my day off. I rest. I don't really care where the sermon is. A lot of things can happen, too, that will derail you. That's why I never delay starting. In fact, I probably start ahead of time because I planned way in advance. I always have things planned out for a year. So could change, but anyway, I don't know how to answer beyond that, but I write, if I'm not done writing on Thursday night, I still take Friday off and rest because I got so, as a full-time pastor, it's so fatiguing, the care you're giving to others and staying in the Word yourself and administrative responsibilities and all that. But then I'd hop up on Saturday morning and the sermons just write themselves. And I told y'all yesterday, if you female and were there, that Sunday, it was not at all unusual for me to redo my sermon on Sunday morning, and it's not frightening. It's a wonderful experience of the Spirit of God just coming in and saying, you know what, your illustration's in the wrong place. That one doesn't work, throw it out. Illustrations are tricky. Anyway, yeah. I'm sorry. Was that it? Anybody else?
More questions? We got time. Are y'all good? No. There we go.
Hi. You mentioned that you printed out your manuscript. So do you use a manuscript and kind of go off of that, or how does that function in your
Well, I was
process?
never allowed to do that in Dr. Smith's class, but since I serve in a community that adheres to the 20 to 23-minute sermon, basically, and now I'm preaching a place where it's televised, so I have to keep the clock. I have learned from experience that if I write a 23 to 2,400 word sermon, I can preach it in 20 minutes or 22 minutes or, So that's how I do it, and that's how I keep myself in time. And that's how I know that I have to throw out a big chunk or put in a big chunk, So that's how I do it. And yes, this is the manuscript I use to preach from on Sunday. Sorry, Dr. Smith. I don't really, you can look at it online, the sermon, if you want. I don't really look at it that much, but it helps me. Y'all, as a pastor, I'm sorry, I worry about people. People could have a heart attack or a stroke while I'm up there preaching, and anything can happen. And you have to be able to right your ship, And so I have kept a manuscript, or at least a very detailed outline for my personal safety net. But I don't think you should look at it very much. My boss preaches, he memorizes his sermons entirely. He walks back and forth like this. I'm not like that. Anyway, yeah. Everybody's different. And you have your own style.
Hi. I'm also coming from a tradition that uses the calendar and in a lectionary text. And sometimes when preaching, there seems to be a tension between you feel the text taking you a certain direction, you feel the needs of your congregation, you feel the church calendar, you feel the other lectionary texts working together. And so you're just pulled in all these different directions. How do you discern which way to go with a sermon? And do you find those tensions helpful or frustrating at times? How do you deal with all of that?
I chose to preach this text. I like tension. I think life is tense for people. And where there's tension, usually there are connections to human life. So I know that's not a really good answer, but I always choose a primary text. I did it less in this sermon than usual. Usually a gospel text is my primary text, and I love narrative preaching. I didn't get to do that here, But yeah, you live into the tension and learn to love it, I think. And sometimes, I have the freedom not to preach from the lectionary too. And sometimes I have said, I just can't manage that this week. If 3 people die in your congregation some week, you just got to have something that you preached in Dr. Smith's class or Dr. Pasquarello's class or somewhere that you can pull out of a drawer too. Not literally, but there are times when you will not have time to prepare a full sermon. And sorry, that wasn't at all related to your question, but I feel like I need to say it.
Do you generally outline the flow of your sermons in a series of movements like that, or do you kind of let where the text and the sermon seems to be leading you determine the form?
I did this
Yeah.
afterwards.
Okay.
I'm not that organized. I'm looking for an arc that goes from wherever we are to hope and to my people. And so, no, I'm not this organized. I love this, though. I might start doing this again.
Connie, I have a question. I remember being introduced to Fred Buechner when I was in seminary, and what we all loved about him was the vivid imagery that he used to make things come alive. So when you're writing a sermon, where do you look to put flesh on the word? And one of the things that I began to learn from Buechner is that canned illustrations sound very abstract and removed from life.
Right.
And yet his writing and his sermons bring you close to life. Right. I mean, how do you work through that as you prepare as you think about a sermon?
How do I work through that? Okay, so Buechner's the way he illustrates and
Yes, yeah.
I don't know. I just watch the language that comes my way out of the text. And in this text, I told y'all I found this like golden thread of storytelling that could carry me all the way through. So I'm always kind of mindful of looking for something that can follow the whole arc of the sermon. I listen to people and how they talk. I listen to situations that are in my proximity. One of the situations that happened while I was writing this sermon was that a staff person's friend died very suddenly due to medical negligence. And her comment about the wife of this man who died is, she's an atheist, but she's mad as hell at God. And you just listen to these things and to people's lives, and imagery just comes up. That's why I write a lot, because you never know what image will help you carry a message. I found that I have to have one to carry. So I don't know about Buechner. He just makes me so happy. That's all,
Good. Thank you. Well, let's thank Reverend Happell. Thank you so much.
Thank you.